I don't know if you caught the article this week about Kim Suotsi, the 23-year-old young woman who, dying of brain cancer, directed that her brain be frozen in the hope that cryonic preservation today will allow tomorrow's science to restore her to what she was. Did you see that? It was on the front page of the New York Times this week. Leaving aside the issue of whether that is even remotely possible, scientifically, we have so much faith in science. For many, science itself is a form of religion, the vestibule of all of our spiritual fantasies for salvation. And leaving aside the issue of whether it is even a good thing for the world, is it good for the ecology? Is it good for the economy? Is it good for humanity that those who are born never die? Only birth occurs, never death. And leaving aside whether a person waking up 10,000 years from now would even be considered the same creature as a 23-year-old in the year 12,015. I mean, really, imagine if somebody were to walk in here now and say that she lived in the year 8,000 BCE, 4,000 years before writing, before recorded history itself. Would we even consider her our kind? A fellow human being? Someone who was born at least 3,000 years or so before the invention of writing? And leaving aside the issue of whether we would even want the capacity to restore not only those who are kind and gentle and good people who died all too young, but would we also want the capability to restore Stalin or Mao or Genghis Khan, or Caligula, or Vespasian? Vespasian was the Roman emperor who destroyed Jerusalem. And leaving aside the issue of whether we could ever restore to working order that part of our brain that caused us to die in the first place, that's a really interesting scientific and philosophical question. Can we cure the disease that killed us after it killed us? Leaving all that aside, I want to ask you this question. If you could live forever, would you want to? If you would never get sick, never get old, never be killed, if you were given the chance to be immortal, would you take it? And I mean, not immortality through posterity, through, say, your family, your writing, your sermons, your building of a company, but literally, you personally would live forever. Would you want that? Woody Allen answered that question this way: I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live in my apartment. The great writer and teacher Jorge Luis Borges wrote a classic story called The Immortal. It is about a Roman soldier, Marcus Rufus, who searches the world for the fabled river of immortality. Finding it, he drinks the waters and becomes immortal. Borges describes the immortals as not much interested in their own fate. Since they would never die, they didn't really bother to take care of their bodies. All they needed was a few hours sleep, a month, a little water, and a scrap of meat. Borges writes that I recall an immortal who I never saw standing. A bird made its nest on his breast. Since the body never died, the body had minimal needs. And the immortals ultimately denigrated the body in favor of the mind. Borges envisions them as all contemplation, all thought, with little attention to physical needs or enjoyments. And he thus introduces two deeply philosophical questions. First, what constitutes mortality? The fact of mortality or the knowledge of mortality? All living things share the common fate of mortality. but it is only human beings who know that they will die. And it is this knowledge that so defines our lives. Borgia brilliantly writes, there is nothing very remarkable about being immortal. With the exception of mankind, all creatures are immortal, for they know nothing of death. What is divine, terrible, and incomprehensible is to know oneself immortal. In other words, it is the knowledge of mortality that defines mortality. Every living thing except us has no consciousness of life and death. And it is this lack of consciousness that gives them a form of immortality. To be unaware of immortality is to be immortal. Borgia suggests that only humans seek immortality because only humans comprehend the concept of death. And when Rufus becomes immortal, it is this knowledge that he will never die that terrifies him, because what we mean by immortality is divine and incomprehensible to human beings. It's one thing for science to extend the lifespan of human beings. We live longer now than people did before. And presumably in the future, people will live longer than today. But it is quite another thing to be immortal. Immortality, according to Borgia, is terrifying because that is the realm of God, not human beings. Perhaps Borgia, who studied Judaism deeply, knew the classic statement from Rabbi Akiva, "Beloved is man, for he was created in the image of God. It was an act of still greater love that it was made known to him that he was created in the image of God." It is the knowledge of being created that gives meaning to creation, at least for human beings. That we were created by God was an act of great love, say the rabbis, but it was an act of even greater love that we know that we were created by God in the divine image as an act of love. It is this knowledge that determines everything. And the second deeply philosophical question that Borgia addresses is the desirability of living forever, of never dying. He writes, "Everything in the world of mortals has the value of irrecoverable and contingent. Among the immortals, on the other hand, nothing is in peril of being lost." And therefore, Borgia writes, all their acts are unimportant because over an infinitely long period of time, all things happen to all people. There are no intellectual or spiritual merits. That is, the point of being alive is that this life has consequences that are contingent and irrecoverable. If nothing is in peril of being lost, nothing is at stake. And if nothing is at stake, what is the purpose of life, at least as we understand human life today? And it was this sense that nothing was at stake that propelled Rufus to search the world for the river that would undo his immortality. He concluded that if he never died, there was nothing to live for. He didn't want to be immortal. Immortality for him was a burden, not a release. Never dying meant never really living. Rufus found peace only when he restored his mortality. The Jewish view of immortality was not living forever. We saw immortality in two fundamental ways, both of them upon the termination of bodily existence. The first was the immortality of the community. Our lives live on within the historical continuity of the people. We have lived, and our life is an eternal ingredient of the eternal people. Second, inspired by Greek philosophers, there was in Judaism speculation about the immortality of the soul. That being created in the image of God, this divine part of us lived eternally. We ponder these things now on this Shabbat, Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, during this season of our deepest reflections on life. Our lives have meaning because they are finite. It is the finitude of life that gives life urgency, poignancy, and a certain eternality. Spend in pure converse our eternal day. Think each and each immediately wise. Learn all we lack before, hear, know, and say what this tumultuous body now denies. And feel who have laid our groping hands away and see, no longer blinded by our eyes.